We're excited to be joined now by Lindsey Burke. She is the director at the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation and also wrote the chapter in Heritage's Mandate for Leadership, also known now as Project 2025, on education policy. This is a very timely conversation given recent developments of the last 24 hours about how DOGE is starting to turn its attention to the Department of Education. So, Lindsey, first of all, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Emily.
Yeah, no, we appreciate it. I think you and I come from a very different place than Ryan does on this, and the question about the question about just what's going to happen to the Department of Education is obviously a sensitive one for parents around the country who are worried about a shutdown affecting them. So, Lindsey, I think maybe a good place to start is actually if you could walk us through, your take on why parents with kids in schools that are almost entirely, unless they're at Hillsdale, funded by the federal government in some part, should not be afraid, from your perspective, of DOGE kind of tackling the Department of Education.
Yeah, well, first we should make a distinction between K-12 and higher ed. So in the K-12 space, federal funding is less than 10% of all school funding across the country. And it's worth noting, and so this is different than higher ed, right, where you get student loans, it's wholly federally funded, 93% of all loans are originated and serviced by the federal government. So two separate things. But in K-12 education, it's very important to remember the Department of Education does not run a single school, it does not pay a single teacher's salary, it does not educate a single child in America. And so I would assuage parents' concerns, and I would make the case to most parents, you will be better off when your local teacher, your local school principal is not having to worry about federal mandates handed down from the Department of Ed. And for taxpayers too, who I think are so often left out of the conversation, for them, it has meant their money is taken, sent to Washington, filtered through this ineffective bureaucracy, and then 65 cents on every dollar is sent back to local classrooms. And somehow that's supposed to improve educational outcomes or lead to academic excellence. And it clearly hasn't. So that's where I would start, just to assuage any concerns parents might have. And the other quick thing I would say is just because the Department of Education is eliminated, and we'll see what ultimately happens, doesn't mean that programs and spending go away. Most of the proposals that are out there, including ours, would move many of the programs that are actually effective or appropriate to other federal agencies. So you look at something like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, funding under IDEA, that would move over to HHS. Data collection, things like the National Assessment for Educational Progress, send it over to the Commerce Department. Let the Census Bureau handle that. Student loans, move them to Treasury. So this idea that eliminating the physical structure of the Department of Education will somehow have negative benefits on education, I think it's quite the opposite.
So the 2025 proposal seemed pretty heavy on block grants. Like we'll take, right now, to take the disabilities provision that you talked about. So you would move that over to HHS, but the key thing there to me seems to be that you would also just block grant it. And for people who don't know, block grant just means, all right, we used to fund, under these requirements, the states had to, submit this kind of paperwork and meet these requirements to get this money. Now we're just going to add up the amount of money, send it all out. And, that means they'll get more money because, it's not going to get filtered through that bureaucracy that you talk about. But imagine you're a parent who has a child in school here who benefits from one of these IEPs or something. It's already, as you know, a war that parents have to go through with their schools to get these IEPs, because you get an IEP, it's going to cost a little bit extra money. So the school districts are generally doing everything they can to say, well, your kid actually doesn't qualify for this. And just to make it so difficult for parents that they just eventually give up and only the most dedicated ones get through. So if you no longer, so it's a war, despite the fact that you have the federal government kind of looking over their shoulder and saying, you need to do this if you're going to get this money. If the federal government just walks away and just hands the money to the schools, given the school's impulse already, why wouldn't the school just reject everybody's IEP, keep the money, cut property taxes, and then use the money to just fund their general operations. And
Yeah.
and there are a couple other block grants. You can remind me, you know this better.
Yeah, Title I, there are a few others in there.
Like, why wouldn't they just do the same thing and just, now the federal government is just, that money isn't supporting these projects, it's just supporting the school, and then the school cuts taxes.
Yeah.
Or the city
So
cuts
a couple
taxes.
of things. So your example with IDEA is a really important one, because I think those are the parents, absolutely right, who have had the most contentious, unfortunately, relationship getting the services that they are entitled to under federal
And it's
law.
something like
for their
15 million
children.
parents have gotten through the thicket, or
Yeah,
15 million
right.
kids, right?
Yeah, right. And so what we want to do is provide them with the tools to actually fight that war effectively and not be reliant on a process where too often they end up in litigation trying to get
Yeah.
the services they are entitled to under federal law. And so what do those tools look like? Once we block grant that funding to the state, so it doesn't go directly to schools, right? So a state could receive the block grant. At that point, a state could decide that parents can have access to their dollars. So states could make those IDEA dollars portable. And if a family wanted, they could take their kid's share of IDEA dollars. And honestly, at the per pupil level, it's not that much in the overall scheme of what we spend per pupil. We're talking about maybe $2,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
But if a parent doesn't feel that their school is providing services appropriately to them, they could tap into that money and they could pay for private services and providers, schools, service providers, whatever it might be, that they feel better meets the needs of their children. The other thing I would add
would that pay for private school, or you're talking about $2,000 a year or something?
Right. So services. So probably additional services, right? It's not going to pay for tuition at a private school. However, if you're in a state that has a school choice program already, and we're now to the point where over half of them do, and most of them are education savings accounts, and most of them started off for kids with special needs, in fact, if you're in one of those states, you could easily envision a family getting an ESA, enrolling in private school, and then under this proposal, also being able to tap in to their funding under IDEA and topping off that amount to get additional services. So you could certainly envision that situation. And we're to the point, by the way, quick non sequitur, if Texas gets school choice this year, which finally it looks like they're going to do, we're going to be at the point where over half of all kids across the country have access to private school choice. So this is happening. But on IDEA specifically at the federal level, I would add that the law that is supposed to protect these children, that doesn't go away. Right. And that law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, predated by the Education for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975, that predated the creation of the Federal Department of Education, as did so many of these laws. Right. So this idea that access or protections for kids with special needs or low-income children go away, all of those protections came well before Carter acquiesced to the teachers union in order to get their support to be elected president and created a Federal Department of Ed. So none of that goes away.
Just from a news perspective, what can you tell us? What do you know about what the Trump officials were doing at Ed yesterday in the sixth floor? That Jen Bender, we had a Jen Bender retweet from HuffPost up there.
Yep.
Other people are saying that 89 contracts were cut, totaling something like $900 million. What do you know about what's been cut so far, and what insight do you have into what further cuts are coming?
Yeah. So I don't have insight into what the administration is doing or thinking yet. I think we're all just waiting to see what a potential executive order might include. And look, I mean, they're
not working with you. I mean, you wrote the blueprint, right?
Look, we put out for years. In fact, I've been at Heritage 17 years now. So for almost 2 decades, we've been writing about the need to wind down the department. And our writing on that predated the chapter that you all referenced there. And so, we have a map for exactly what you would do with every single program. We have a 3-part test, which programs you would keep. Are they ineffective? Are they duplicative? Or are they inappropriate at the federal level? If they check any of those boxes, they're gone. The handful of programs that remain, we map out more appropriate receiving agencies to manage those programs. And so all of that's out there. I'm very excited to see an administration finally willing to try to correct Carter's mistake and wind down this bureaucracy. I mean, look at the recent NAEP outcomes, right? They were awful. Kids have lost, just if you look at 4th grade reading, kids have lost almost a year's worth of learning, almost a grade level worth of learning just over the past decade. And I mean, the recent outcomes were really just heartbreaking for so many families. And this has been a trend that has continued since 1965, right? And we talk about the department, but really it was the war on poverty, right? It was Lyndon Johnson, it was 1965 when we first see the federal government get involved in pre-K and K-12 ed and higher education. There have been no improvements as a result of that involvement. You look at the gap between low-income children and more affluent kids, it's 4 grade levels worth of learning. 4. It's exactly the same today as it was in 1965. We have just not moved the needle and improved academic outcomes to speak of. And so, yeah, we're all very excited to see the administration make some of these important cuts. And as far as, what contracts and programs we will see, we know that there is a lot of DEI adjacent stuff that has infused the department over the past few years. So hopefully that's first on the chopping block.
Before we move to higher ed, I wanted to just get your take on this. Here are the collapsing scores I think that you were just referring to, which also show an increase. From and you have other ones that show an increase before. I feel like correlation is not causation. I look at the timing of some of these collapses, and I see the rise of kind of cell phones and social media and screens. But let me go a little bit further. So when you look at these long-term trends, so this is from your Project 2025 document here, pretty flat, flat and rising for 13-year-old reading, rising for 9-year-old reading, going back to 1971, rising for math for 13-year-olds and 9-year-olds, though, falling a bit, around the pandemic and screens. I think a combination of those two things. So what do you think accounts for the increase? Like if you look at those numbers, like I said, correlation is not causation, but
sure.
Department of Education came around and scores went up for decades. Screens came in and scores went down. So, and then the pandemic, an absolute catastrophe for schooling. So how is unwinding this going to reverse that? Yeah.
So what we didn't include, and we should have, are the 12th grade results. If you look at the 12th grade results, they are flat in reading, flat in math. And so even though we see some increase in reading and math for 13-year-olds and 9-year-olds, that doesn't persist throughout high school. And so we're just not seeing those gains throughout the years. The longer a kid spends in school, the less the gains are, are there over time. And so should have included that too. Look, in terms of the department, again, I would certainly not peg the department to any of those increases. And if you look at the charts where you see those slight increases that, again, don't persist over time, they do correlate more with, one could argue, some of the accountability measures that, and I'm no fan of No Child Left Behind, but that were included in NCLB. And I mention that because there was a concerted effort at that point to care about reading outcomes. The way that the federal government wrote NCLB, the sanctions that were put into place did not work well at all for states. But we did see a focus at that time on reading by 3rd grade. You look at Florida at that time period, right? You had Jeb Bush there, who would continue to beat the drum about, if a kid from kindergarten to 3rd grade is learning to read, from 3rd grade on, they're reading to learn, right? And if they don't get that right, they're going to have a very hard time throughout the rest of their academic experience. And so there was a real focus. And so I think that focus on reading may account for some of those early gains. But again, they didn't persist. And I am also heartened to see that we have a renewed focus on phonics-based instruction now. That's something that is long overdue. We had this shift toward whole language, which we know really failed, honestly, generations of children in learning to read. And so that's been great to see a renewed focus on phonics-based instruction. So hopefully that will accrue to the benefit of reading in the next few years. But yeah, I mean, the pandemic declines, and I say pandemic declines, these were teacher union induced school closures that kept kids locked out of schools, right? Far after we knew it was safe for schools to reopen. And so those significant declines lay squarely at the feet of the teachers union's heads. And that's gonna stick with these kids for decades to come, unfortunately.
Well, I wanted to ask one question, Lindsey, sort of from a conservative perspective. It's kind of different for me to imagine if this was a Ron DeSantis administration versus a Trump administration with Elon Musk coming in. People like you really have spent years carefully crafting detailed plans, like granular level plans, as to how to, put the Department of Education on an off ramp, essentially, with all kinds of ideas as to how gaps that would happen if the centralized federal department is shut down will be filled. And I'm curious if it worries you at all the way that DOGE has approached other departments, without debating what should have happened to USAID. Even just the way that it was sort of like an ad hoc. We're finding something here. Gone, like the Mille afuera approach to government. Right. So does any of that concern you, that you have this carefully crafted, ideologically sound plan from a conservative perspective, and you kind of have the wrecking ball coming for different departments now?
No, it doesn't. Honestly, we need a wrecking ball at Ed. And we're in the, I would say, enviable position that families across the country understand through experience and just intuitively that the Department of Ed has failed them over the years. We don't have to make the case. Look, I go and give talks all the time, and the biggest applause line is always close down the Department of Ed. I mean, it is, so we're in a good position there. I think there's a fairly high level of understanding among the public at large about how little the investment is at the federal level in K-12 ed relative to the red tape and regulations that the agency hands down. So, I think with USAID, there was just less, I think, understanding about what the agency does among the general population. And so I think we're on pretty solid ground there.
So what would funding levels look like in your ideal world? As we look at the world now, it's so hard for teachers to live near their schools, for instance, or to just live a dignified life, which makes it then harder to attract kind of the best people into the field. So what does it look like in your world where you've gotten rid of the Department of Education?
Yeah. Look, I agree, right? I mean, for teachers, so over the decades, the unions made a decision that they wanted more teachers rather than, and I say teachers, they wanted more education employees, right? So I should add, the teacher to non-teacher ratio right now is 1-to-1. If you look at your typical school district, for every teacher in a classroom, there's an administrative counterpart. So the unions made a decision over the years to prioritize increasing staff because, of course, that accrued to the benefit of their bottom line, right? More dues paying members, rather than taking ever increasing state, local, and federal spending and putting that into higher teacher salaries. So that was a conscious decision that was made on the part of special interest groups. We should pay teachers more, those who deserve to be paid more, right? We should reward teachers based on merit, right? Not just on the amount of time that they've spent in the classroom. But that will require some changes, right? It's going to require us to no longer have this staff surge that we have had over really since the 1960s to, put a damper on that. I mean, we've had a 100% increase in the number of students in schools since the 1970s, but a 700% increase in the number of administrators, right? Just to put a finer point on it. So we need to stop that staffing surge, but we also need to be willing to say, modestly increase class size a little bit, right? We know that at some point there's a diminishing return on reducing class size, and it is low. Nationally, it's 15-to-1, right? So you could modestly increase class size, and then you could pretty significantly increase teacher pay for those teachers who increase student learning, right? If you get more than a year or a year's worth of learning over time, you deserve to be rewarded for that.
How do we get to that 15-to-1 number? I don't know.
So that's
I don't know anybody
National Center for Education.
No, I'm not doubting that that's the stat, but like what happened such that I bet most people watching this are gonna be like, there's 28 kids in my kid's class.
And I should say that's high school numbers. So if you look at your elementary and your elementary numbers, they are slightly higher, but for your typical high school, 15-to-1. So
interesting.
To your question, which I don't think I answered, about what is the appropriate spending level, and are you thinking per pupil, or are you thinking at the federal level what we should be spending? Either.
I think what matters most really is what gets down to the schools.
Exactly. Yeah, 100% agree. So at the federal level, if you look at the plan that we've worked on for 2 decades now, what we have recommended is that you eliminate all of the competitive grant funding that the feds manage. It is completely ineffective. It has not moved the needle at all in terms of student learning outcomes. That's a lot of programs. It's not a lot of spending, to be honest. It's maybe not a lot, maybe $3 billion of the department's budget. So that would go away immediately. And there are certainly other areas where you could cut as well. But those large formula grant programs, which is where most of the funding is, those are the programs that would just go to other receiving agencies. So again, you actually probably wouldn't see that large of a reduction in existing federal spending, but you would see some, and you should see some. As far as what the ideal per pupil spending level is, just to give the listeners an idea, we spend about $18,000 per pupil per year now nationally. So that's combined local, state, and federal revenue. And of course, the federal piece is a small share of that. It's about 45% federal, I'm sorry, 45% state, 45% local, 10% federal funding. I would say we don't know the ideal number because we don't have a market-based system, right? We have a system that runs and functions much more like a monopoly than a market. But we can look at the school choice programs that are expanding in the state and get some sense of what it does cost to educate a child. If you look at education savings account options in the states like Arizona, they're getting about $7,000 per kid. That's a base per pupil allocation. If you have a kid with special needs, you get a little more money. It's weighted based on disability. And that is working great for families. Families are choosing to enter that program to take that amount of funding and then go find services that work for them rather than staying in the district system where they're spending twice that much and they're not getting a quality education. So it's hard to say exactly what it should be, but the evidence strongly suggests we don't need to spend $18,000 per child per year.
Is this a vicious cycle? Like, are the public schools that are seeing all of these kids leave and go to these private schools funded by the school choice, are they quickly collapsing? And
we haven't seen any close yet, honestly, and we should, right? I mean, schools that are trapping kids, cycles, and generations of kids in these ineffective institutions, they shouldn't be around, right? No kid should be trapped in a school that is failing them. We're not seeing schools close yet, but we do see the kids who are least well served by these schools having an escape hatch out of them. And that tends to be the case with, even if you look at states with universal choice programs or really large choice options, you look at Florida, you look at Arizona, it is still an escape valve for these kids. So we haven't seen schools shutting down. I think two things are going to put more pressure on public schools than any school choice option. One is just the demographic collapse that's coming, right? I mean, that will put a lot of pressure on public schools in the future to either consolidate or downsize. They're just not going to have kids in seats because of the fertility crisis, right, not because of school choice. And then the other thing is, if the argument of those on the left against choice was, well, it's going to harm public schools, right? We should be laser focused on funding children and not institutions. But if that were the case, why allow public school choice at all? Why allow families to even buy a house in another neighborhood, right? Like anytime you exercise public school choice, that money leaves an assigned school and goes to another school. Same with charters, right? So this idea that private school choice is either going to lead to the end of public education as we know it, or that it already has, isn't founded. And I always come back to the Friedman argument, right? That we will publicly finance K-12 education, but the public financing does not require government delivery of services. So fund the kid, separate that out, allow the family to choose what works for them.
We're running out of time to talk about higher ed.
I was going to say,
which I'm sure a lot of our viewers are deeply concerned about. What kind of wrecking ball are you guys bringing to the university system?
Well, hopefully the biggest one of all, right? It needs higher ed. Wow. I mean, it's more than a PR problem at this point, right? I mean, higher ed has entrenched systemic issues that will only be solved when we cut off the open spigot of federal aid that has been dumped on these universities from federal helicopters, to quote Richard Vedder. He's an economist at the University of Ohio for decades now. If you look at the outcome of federal spending on higher ed. And again, it all goes back to Lyndon Johnson, right? It all goes back to 1965. Prior to that, we did not have widely available student loans and grants originated by the feds, right? We had the GI Bill, but that was targeted. It was an earned benefit, right? But once we got the feds involved in 65, then we just see this inflation in tuition prices over the decades. And it had gotten so bad by the 80s, and I think everybody knows this at this point, but in 1987, Bill Bennett, who was Ronald Reagan's ed secretary, he wrote a famous op-ed in, I think it was the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, but it was called Our Greedy Colleges. And he said, continued spending at the federal level will lead colleges to increase prices. Sure enough, and that was called the Bennett hypothesis. It became true, right? I mean, we know that that's the case. And even if you look at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, they did a study a few years ago where they found that for every additional dollar in subsidized student loans, universities increased tuition 60 cents. So they're capturing much of that federal largesse that's going there. But it has really enabled universities to not mind shop the way that they should, right? I mean, it has allowed this proliferation of DEI commissariat to just, I think, really drain resources from higher ed and not create a better learning environment for students. It's enabled this facilities arms race where you get the climbing walls and the lazy rivers, right? I mean, it has really just been detrimental to higher ed. The prices increasing for students, and then we've had this policy over the decades of just trying to subsidize increases in costs, which haven't worked at all. And so hopefully the wrecking ball includes eliminating the PLUS loan program, right? So this is all of the federal lending for grad students and for parents of undergrads, right? So you've got the main direct loan program that goes to undergrad students and grad students. But then once you exhaust that, you can plus up, right? You can get additional funding from the federal taxpayer, subsidized by the federal taxpayer for grad school, or parents can borrow even more for their undergrads. And so if you ever hear these horror stories of people entering retirement with student loan debt, that largely falls at the feet of the Parent Plus program, where they borrowed for their kids' undergrad experience. The parents did. And so we need to cut off that open spigot of federal aid and restore to the private lending market responsibility for offering student loans and grants.
And is the goal then that fewer kids go to college?
No, I mean, the goal is people for whom college is the right decision have access to that and can go, and that those students who take out a loan repay that loan. And this is the problem, right? We have
How do they get access if they don't? Let's say, so
Sure.
just lay it out.
Sure.
You want to go, can't afford it. Yep. Schools are now ungodly expensive. Mm-hmm. How do you go?
Yeah, well, so back to what I said a second ago, our proposal doesn't eliminate the direct loan program, which is the basic loan program that the feds operate. 55,000 aggregate right now, I believe. Right. It's on that order, about 50.
Which is good for about like 1 year in college.
Well, I don't know whether that's the case, right? I mean, you look at some of your state schools, that's not the case. And everybody forgets, by the way, Ryan, that you can also work while you're in school, right? I mean, this is...
I did work study. I made $4.25 an hour. There was a minimum wage went up. I got a 10-cent raise while I was there.
Exactly.
That was beer money, though. Like, that's not paying for college money. This is not the 1960s anymore.
But look, you can also do that. But so the direct loan program stays in place. So we're talking about loans for grad students. We're talking about that additional Parent Plus loan. But if you eliminate some of the federal largesse, you're going to see that there is still a private lending market, right? So it's not just the federal, granted, it's 7% of the market, but you can still get a loan through the private sector as well. And look, we need to have a lending program in place that actually does take into account your ability to repay in the future. Because what we have now is just open access to federal taxpayer dollars. I call them federal taxpayer dollars because they're subsidized and because we're forgiving them on the back end in large part. And so, we have not encouraged students to really take a hard look at the school they're attending, the education they're getting, what the ROI will be on the back end. I mean, 44% of master's degrees have a negative ROI, right? And so we have enabled this profligacy on the part of higher ed institutions, but also have created a situation in which students aren't well served at all. And yeah, we might have too many people going to college right now. There are people who would probably be better served not going that route, doing apprenticeship programs, doing career and technical ed options. But the federal government has put the thumb on the scale in favor of traditional higher ed and has said this is your only path to climbing the ladder of upward economic mobility in America. And that is an unfortunate falsehood that has not served students well at all.
So if you keep those loan programs in place, or the one that we were just discussing,
Yeah.
how quickly reasonably would tuition prices be expected to go down and there would be a
Yep.
market correction? Because it seems to me there might be a gap period where college is still
Yeah.
ungodly expensive
Yeah.
indefinitely.
Yeah, there will probably be a gap, but there are other things we can do concurrent with the loan program to help prices decrease. One of those, which has gotten some attention over the past few days, is indirect cost, which is this sort of like arcane little policy idea, but basically capping the overhead costs that universities can charge federal taxpayers for research grants.
Mm.
NIH, this was floating around a few days ago, where NIH said we're now going to cap at 15% your amount of indirect costs. I mean, there are universities out there right now that are charging the taxpayer 60 cents on the dollar for their research grant overhead. I mean, it's unbelievable. And so, again, this is a part of the federal largesse that has been handed down for decades now that has enabled universities to continually increase prices, knowing that there's more federal money coming on the back end. They need some spending restraint imposed upon them. And this is the only way we're ultimately going to see prices brought down, is through reforms to loan programs, reforms to some of these other grant options that are out there.
I mean, isn't research, though, one of the most overhead intensive things you could possibly have? And aren't they required to say, like, here are the actual specific overhead costs that are connected to
they're very
this
broad.
research?
What a university does, they'll say, here's the indirect rate that we charge. They might say, we'll accept a grant from, I don't know, fill in the blank, Google, and we'll accept a 5% overhead rate from Google, but we're going to charge the federal taxpayer 60 cents for research grants. So we know that what they're charging the federal taxpayer is higher than what they necessarily need. And so one of the most interesting proposals, and this is my colleague Jay Green at Heritage has put this proposal out, but basically putting some market discipline in the indirect rate, where you say to a university at the federal level, you cannot charge the federal government an indirect rate that exceeds what you're willing to accept from a private funder. And so it just sort of resets. And yeah, look, of course, universities have some fixed costs. Of course, research has some fixed costs, but they will argue all of their costs are fixed, right? And that's certainly not the case. They'll use this to fund infrastructure where they have names on buildings, right, of donors who have privately provided significant funding, right? You have all of the Title IV programs, all of the student loan and grant options that are out there, other direct grants from the federal government. You've got private foundations, philanthropy. Universities are swimming in money. This idea that putting a little discipline on their overhead rate that they're charging the taxpayer is somehow going to have this detrimental effect on research, totally unfounded.
I just worry that. So why not invest in technical schools, trade schools,
Sure.
In addition to colleges and universities? I worry that in the 70s and 80s and 90s we decided to, as a policy, destroy our manufacturing base, and the thing that is keeping us afloat is our college and university system in the United States. Like that, it's the thing that makes us globally competitive and makes people want to live here. For like the most talented people in the world want to come here. But like, we're gonna gut that too, and then it's just gonna be a wasteland. Like, what do we have at that point?
Yeah, I hear you on that, but I think we are a little naive in believing that the quality of higher ed is equally distributed among institutions. It is not. We have a lot of underperforming colleges and universities in this country. There are great, like the schools that we're probably thinking of, the great schools, right? You've got some great state schools that are out there, the flagship universities. You have some great smaller private great book schools and other faith-based schools that are doing really well. But you've got a lot of middling schools across the country, right? There are 4,000 or so colleges across the country. A non-trivial number of those schools are having students leave, right? And by the way, they're spending 6 years on average to get a 4-year degree. They're leaving with debt. Some of them leave and don't even get the paper credential that they were promised. And that's the worst situation that they can be in. And we know it's ineffective because employers report that constantly, that students who leave college are not prepared to enter the workforce. And so, is there a better way to serve the needs of those students? Can we do more to give them flexibility with those existing federal funds to pursue career and technical ed? Right. So, at the end of the day, our position is simply you want to give students flexibility if we're going to fund this at the federal level with the type of post-secondary education they pursue. Right. Maybe they do go into a trade where they are leaving with no debt and making a good living right out of the gate. But right now, we're saying to everybody, you've got to go to a 4-year brick and mortar. And by the way, probably a majority of them are not going to serve you very well in the long run.
Lindsey, we could keep going on this, but we really appreciate your time and your willingness to talk through some of these difficult questions that'll definitely be on people's minds in the days and weeks ahead. Thank you. We appreciate it.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.